For most of human history, researchers estimate that nearly half of all children died before the age of 15. Half. And yet enough survived generation after generation to produce every single person alive today. The math on that shouldn't work, but it did. Here's what we've been told, more or less by default because nobody ever corrects it. Ancient parenting was simple. Feed the kid, keep it warm, keep it close, hope for the best. A lower stakes, lower effort version of what we do now, just without the gadgets. That's the assumption sitting quietly underneath almost every conversation about natural parenting today. And it's wrong. Not wrong in the details, wrong in the entire premise. Ancient parenting wasn't simpler than modern parenting. It was, in almost every measurable way, harder, more demanding, and far more sophisticated than the sanitized picture we've built in our heads. The reason nearly half of all children survived those odds wasn't luck stacked on luck. It was a system, a real one with mechanisms, redundancies, and division of labor that modern parenting has almost entirely lost, mostly because we no longer need it, but partly because we've forgotten it ever existed. Let's start with the first pillar, and it's the one most people never think about: birth itself. Modern childbirth happens in rooms with monitors, sterile instruments, and a team trained specifically for the moment things go wrong. Ancient childbirth had none of that, and the maternal mortality rate reflects it. Some estimates for pre-modern societies put it as high as one maternal death for every 20 to 30 births across a woman's reproductive lifetime. That number alone should stop you. It means an enormous number of children in human history began their lives already having lost or being at risk of losing the single person biologically wired to keep them alive. So the first survival mechanism wasn't medical, it was social. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have documented something called alloparenting, the practice of child rearing being distributed across a wide network of caregivers, rather than resting entirely on one or two biological parents. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated adults within the group all took on direct caregiving roles, feeding, caring, and protecting children who weren't biologically theirs. This wasn't occasional babysitting. In some documented Hadza and Kungs groups, infants were held by someone other than their mother for a significant portion of daylight hours, sometimes passed between 6 or more different caregivers in a single day. If the mother died, or was injured, or simply needed to forage without an infant strapped to her body, the system didn't collapse.
It absorbed the loss and kept going. That's not a backup plan. That's the actual architecture of ancient child rearing, built from the ground up to survive the failure of any single caregiver. Now here's where it gets more interesting, because the second pillar isn't social. It's biological, and it's happening inside the child itself. Human infants are born, by any objective measure, absurdly underdeveloped compared to almost every other mammal. A newborn horse stands and walks within hours. A newborn human can't hold up its own head for months. Researchers call this altriciality, and the explanation usually offered is straightforward: our heads are too big to fully develop in the womb without endangering the mother during birth, so evolution made a trade-off: kick the baby out early, finish the development on the outside. But that trade-off created an enormous survival problem. A helpless infant is a liability in an environment full of predators, disease, and unpredictable food supply. So a second system evolved to compensate. Human infants are wired with an unusually intense and unusually specific set of attachment behaviors, crying at a pitch and rhythm that's almost impossible for an adult brain to ignore, eye contact that triggers oxytocin release in caregivers, a grip reflex strong enough to support the infant's own body weight. None of this is decorative. Every one of these traits exists because infants that triggered stronger caregiving responses got more attention, more protection, and more calories than infants who didn't. Over enough generations, human babies essentially evolved to be irresistible, because irresistible babies survived and forgettable ones didn't. Here's the myth this actually dismantles. We tend to think of infant helplessness as a design flaw, something evolution somehow failed to fix. It's the opposite. The prolonged helplessness and the intense caregiver triggering behaviors are two halves of the same system, built to function together. The baby can't do anything for itself. So the baby became extraordinarily good at making sure it didn't have to. Let's talk about food next, because feeding a child in the ancient world was a genuinely brutal logistical puzzle, and the solution to it might be one of the most underrated inventions in human history: the fact that women could breastfeed a child that wasn't biologically their own. Anthropologists have documented wet nursing and cross-feeding across an enormous range of hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, not as a rare emergency measure, but as a routine, expected practice. If a mother's milk supply failed, if she died, if she was too sick to nurse, another lactating woman in the group would step in, sometimes permanently, sometimes just for days until the crisis passed. This mattered enormously, because unlike almost every other food source available to ancient humans, breast milk required no preparation, no cooking, no hunting, and carried almost none of the bacterial risk that raw meat or contaminated water did. It was the single most reliable calorie source in the entire environment, and the fact that it could be transferred between women meant a child's survival wasn't permanently tied to one specific body. Weaning itself was staged carefully, too, though not through any written manual. Anthropological studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups show children were often nursed for 3 to 4 years, far longer than typical in modern industrialized societies, precisely because solid food in that environment was inconsistent, hard to digest for small children, and often risky. Milk was the safety net. Extended nursing wasn't indulgence. It was risk management. Now for the midpoint reversal, because this is where the story stops being purely about biology and starts being about knowledge, and knowledge turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire picture. You'd assume the primary killer of ancient children was violence, predators, or starvation. It mostly wasn't. The overwhelming majority of child deaths in the pre-modern world came from something far less dramatic: infectious disease and, closely behind it, accidental injury inside camp. And the countermeasure to both of those threats wasn't strength or speed. It was accumulated, transmitted environmental knowledge, held disproportionately by the oldest members of the group. This is where grandmothers re-enter the story, and it's worth pausing here because the data is genuinely remarkable. Researchers studying the demographic patterns of hunter-gatherer societies developed what's known as the grandmother hypothesis, which argues that human females evolved an unusually long post-reproductive lifespan specifically because older women who could no longer bear children of their own dramatically increased the survival odds of their grandchildren. Studies comparing hunter-gatherer families with and without a living grandmother present found meaningfully higher child survival rates in households where a grandmother was actively involved in foraging, feeding, and childcare. This wasn't sentimental support. It was direct caloric and safety contribution, plus something even more valuable: decades of accumulated knowledge about which plants were toxic, which water sources made people sick, which sounds in the night meant danger and which didn't, passed down through direct instruction and constant supervision. A 3-year-old wandering near an unfamiliar berry bush wasn't relying on instinct to know it was poisonous. They were relying on someone older having already learned that lesson, sometimes generations earlier, and having never stopped repeating it. This is the reversal worth sitting with. We tend to imagine ancient childhood as a kind of survival of the fittest gauntlet where the toughest kids made it and the rest didn't. That's not what the evidence shows. It shows a society engineering every possible redundancy specifically so that toughness was never the deciding factor. The goal wasn't to filter for strong children. The goal was to make sure fewer children ever needed to be strong enough to survive on their own in the first place. There's a documented case that makes this system almost painfully visible: the Ake people of Paraguay, extensively studied by anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado across decades of fieldwork. Ake children, particularly in the years before regular contact with outside settlements, faced child mortality rates that were staggering by modern standards, but the Ake had developed an entire cultural framework around collective responsibility for every child's survival, not just their own biological offspring. Food sharing was mandatory, not optional. A successful hunter was expected to distribute meat across the entire band, including to families with no hunter of their own. Children of deceased or incapacitated parents were absorbed into other households without hesitation or stigma. The system wasn't a moral nicety. It was survival infrastructure, built because everyone in the group understood, at some level, that the difference between a child living and dying often had nothing to do with that specific family's effort or love, and everything to do with whether the wider group's safety net held. Now let's zoom out, because there's a systemic implication here that connects everything we've covered. Every mechanism we've talked about: alloparenting, the infant's built-in attachment triggers, wet nursing, the grandmother hypothesis, mandatory food sharing, shares one common feature. None of them rely on any single point of failure. Ancient child rearing wasn't a fragile chain where one broken link meant the child died. It was a redundant network, deliberately overbuilt, where the failure of any one part, a mother's death, a bad hunting season, an illness, could be absorbed by the rest of the system without the child necessarily being lost. Modern parenting, for all its medical advantages, has in some ways quietly dismantled that redundancy. The nuclear family model isolates caregiving into one or two adults, often without the wider network of alloparents, without a resident grandmother, without a group with a binding obligation to share resources when a family falls short. We've replaced the ancient safety net with individual medical intervention and individual responsibility, and for the specific dangers of infectious disease and injury, that trade has been overwhelmingly positive. But it's worth noticing what got lost in the exchange: an entire distributed, redundant system of collective childcare that our species relied on for the overwhelming majority of its existence, and that our biology, our attachment triggers, our extended childhood helplessness, our capacity to nurse another woman's child, is still fundamentally built to expect. So here's what this actually means. That child who survived against nearly 50% odds wasn't lucky, and they weren't tougher than the ones who didn't make it. They were the product of a system: mothers, grandmothers, alloparents, an entire group bound together by obligation and shared risk, working in overlapping layers so that no single failure was ever fatal on its own. You are descended, without exception, from every one of those successful chains. Every caregiver who stepped in. Every grandmother who remembered which berries would kill you. Every stranger in the group who shared meat with a family that wasn't theirs. None of that was optional generosity. It was the actual mechanism that got you here. The system worked. And somewhere underneath every modern parenting instinct you've ever had, it's still quietly running.